today's webinar. My name is John Beller. I'm a Customer Success Manager at YCharts, and hosting our webinar today is my colleague Rushi Shah. He's a sales engineer here. For today's webinar, we're going to focus on how best to utilize YCharts to use our new relative calculations. Throughout this webinar, we're going to have a live Q&A via the chat. You can enter the questions at the lower right corner of the webinar screen. We're going to do our best to answer all questions in a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. But keep in mind, any questions that aren't answered during the Q&A session will reach out directly to you by your support contact. And please keep in mind that the content of this webinar is meant for educational purposes only and is not intended to be used as investment advice, nor is YCharts acting as an advising party regarding client funds in any way. And remember, as always, a recording of the webinar will be made available on the website and sent to all the attendees afterward. So now I'm going to pass it off to Rushi to get started.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Rushi Shah, and I'm a sales engineer here at YCharts. Today, we're going to discuss one of our newest data sets called relative calculations. So here's a little bit on our agenda for today. We're going to start off with that basic overview of what really makes up relative calculations, how they're computed, and also some basic use cases. Afterwards, we're going to go into some macroeconomic factors and also some market fundamentals just to get a good idea of maybe some places that we can start leveraging these relative calculations on YCharts and using them through different tools like the screener, like your watch list, and different portions there on YCharts. So we could get started here. So to start off, we can talk about what relative calcs are, and they're basically designed to help view a security's metrics in relation to either the market, the sector, or the industry that it's a part of. So if you're looking at a U.S. stock, it's going to be compared to the S&P 500, and if you're looking at a Canadian stock, it'll be compared to the TSX Composite. And here's just a basic overview of the computation. So you'll use the relative, for example, if we're looking at the relative PE ratio of a stock, and the relative PE, or the PE ratio is 10, while the market has a PE ratio of 20, then that relative calculation would be 0.5 as a ratio. So you can view that as 0.5 or 50%, however you wanted to basically analyze that metric. And to kind of give a little bit more of an overview of how this can be useful, we could jump into Excel really quickly. We built this out to show you just how valuable this information can be. This is just a basic overlay of Apple and some of its competitors up here, and we're looking at the relative calculations for each of these fundamental metrics on the left and what their calculation would be. So for example, Apple has a relative current ratio versus its sector of 0.67, and you can quickly view and do some analysis on which metrics are favorable for which stocks. And if I come up here and change this sector to market, for example, it'll update some of those relative calculations and give you all of these metrics versus the market. So it's a really quick way to analyze and sift through some different competitors if that's the kind of analysis you're trying to do. So to jump back in to YCharts in general, we're going to do a little bit of like a macroeconomic overview and then look at some market fundamentals as well. Maybe that'll give us a little bit of an overview of which relative calculations we want to use on YCharts. So just basic yield curve analysis here. This is one of our Excel templates as well on our site, and it's basically just the yield curve from today and the yield curve from last year. So some of the things you might be reading about in the media is mentioning a bear flattening yield curve that's been going on for a lot of 2017 and moving into this year. And a lot of that is because of a new Fed chair and some anticipation of rates rising. So maybe two relative metrics that we can use in our analysis today is an ROIC and a lower debt to equity ratio. And another pretty important metric that people are looking at, or an economic indicator, is inflation. So we can take that into our analysis as well and take a look at how inflation expectations are increasing. So maybe there's a little bit more pressure on equities to perform well. So as I move on in my analysis, I can go into YCharts actually, and one of our more popular economic indicators is the cyclically adjusted PE ratio. And so as I type that in, you'll see that it comes up here at the top under economic data. So when I click into the CAPE ratio, you have all this information. I just want to quickly look at the chart here. So as I click on that chart, and maybe let's look at a 10-year overview. I'm kind of seeing that the PE ratio here is at highs in the last 10 years. So maybe we want to look at a relative PE ratio that's pretty favorable. So that could be another point of analysis that we can use. So just to overlay, or just to review what we just went over on those three different macroeconomic factors, if you want to keep your sector exposure consistent with a benchmark, maybe that's something that we can use in the screener. And then we can do a little bit more analysis on that relative debt to equity, relative ROIC, and relative PE ratio. So let's go right back into YCharts. And let's look at where we can use these relative calcs. So I'm just going to start off on my dashboard, and we're going to go into the screener. So as I hover over Tools up here and click on Equity Screener, I'm taken into our screening tool. So I have a relative calculation screen actually saved down for this webinar, and basically it is a couple metric filters. It's just the S&P 500, and it has the relative debt to equity ratio versus the market that's less than 1 and greater than 0.75. So maybe that's a little bit of a tilt on the lower end in relation to the market. The second one I have on here is the relative ROIC versus the sector. And that I would want greater than 1, so that it's basically above average for that sector. And I'll add one more metric filter in here. And I'm going to go with the relative PE ratio. So as you can see, let me back up a little bit here. All I had to do was click on Add a Metric Filter, and this filter box is going to come up. And I could just search for that relative PE ratio right here. And let's do it versus the sector. So I'm going to click on that, and I want that to be less than 1. Basically what I'm saying is I want that PE ratio to be less than the sector average. The nice thing here is that you can do analysis on multiple sectors at the same exact time, because some technology companies might not have the same structure as an energy or materials stock, for example. So it's nice when you can compare it versus their respective sectors, because then you get that same exact analysis there. So as I hit submit here, I have about 12 results left in my screener. This is a nice place to start off and really take a deeper dive into some of these stocks and perhaps learn a little bit more about them. Another thing that I love using, and a lot of our clients love using as well, is our scoring models feature right here. So as I click on that, I created a score for our relative calc analysis here. And basically I added in the relative PE ratio, relative ROIC, and relative debt to equity. So it's the same metrics we're screening by, but I also have a couple additional ones like 1-year total return. Maybe that's pretty important for you to look at, and maybe we can also look at a return on equity based on our inflation analysis earlier. So now what you can do is you can decide if it's better, if it's lower, higher, or closer to 0. Obviously for PE ratio, I would want a lower relative PE ratio. and then you can weight them based on what's most important to you. So I have those weights in here for now. Now I can just click on Add Score column. Now that I have this score in here, I have all 12 of these stocks ranked based on that score that I just made. So as you can see, maybe CSX is a good place to start with my analysis, and it looks like they're pretty favorable on all three of the metrics that we were looking at: debt to equity, ROIC, and PE ratio. So maybe that's a good place to start with my analysis. A couple other really cool things that you can do here is, now that I have this screen saved and it's something that I want to look at, moving forward, and I want to be notified when things come into and out of this screen, you could click up here on Activate Alerts, and that'll go ahead and let me know via email whenever a change is made on here. Also, I can save this list as a watch list and really keep an eye on them. So if I click on Save as Watch List, and let's just call this a relative calcs list, for example, and hit Save. Now all 12 of these companies are saved down. Now if I go to my dashboard, I can go ahead and add this watch list onto my dashboard and keep an eye on it. Now the really cool thing about this as well is this data tab right here on my watch list. I can actually edit this. So I'm going to go ahead and take out some of the ones that I don't really want to take a look at. For example, PE ratio, revenue, perhaps we can take off. And I can add in some of those relative calcs right on here, so they're right in front of me when I go to my dashboard. So if I add a metric to data view, I can go ahead and add that relative PE ratio, and perhaps we could do one more, and I could just add in that relative ROIC. So now you have that right in front of you to look at for that list of stocks from that screen. So it's a really useful tool that we have to do your analysis, to really look at how these different companies are in relation to either the market sector or the industry. Just some other details on where these calculations are coming from. If you hover over data and click on sectors, we have all of our sectors broken out here, and we have all the data points that are made up of each of these sectors. So if I go ahead and click into technology, for example, I'll be able to see that all of these fundamental ratios for the technology sector, that's where the relative calculations are coming from. So for example, we were looking at the relative PE ratio versus the sector. That's going to come from this 31.4 right here. So it's a nice little overview of the sector, and then if I want to go into that specific industry, I could just click on industries and go into it and view some of these metrics as well. Now, the last tool I wanted to really show for relative calculations would be comp tables. So if I go into tools and click on comp tables, what I can do is I can actually pull in that watch list that we were just looking at. And if I just want like a quick overview of some of the different relative calcs, similar to in Excel that we were looking at, I could just pull in all of some of those relative valuation metrics and have a quick data table view of these right next to each other. So it's a nice and clean way to take a look at this, and you can definitely export that data to Excel. So that's really all I have on the content portion. I'll go ahead and pass it back over to John to go over some of the questions that we got.
Cool. Thank you for that, Rushi. As Rushi mentioned, we had just a couple questions that came through during the content portion of the webinar. And one of the first questions we received was about the yield curve slide that Rushi showed, and someone asked if they can print that yield curve out. And the answer is yes, you can. We actually have a yield curve template that you can access. And you can go to the Excel tab on YCharts and then click on templates. And towards the bottom of this page, we will have the Treasury yield curve template. So you can access it right there. You can save the chart, put it into any presentations or reports that you're generating. And then the next question we had was, can I set alerts for these relative calculations? And that was a good question since we didn't really cover that during the webinar. And you can set alerts for these relative calculations. It's very similar to other alerts that you can set on YCharts. So you can first go to any company that you would like to set the alert for. Click on create an alert up at the top. And then right in that first box, you can type in the relative calculation you're looking for. And then if you'd like to know if it's over or under value, you can choose over or under 1 at that point. So you can set alerts for all those relative calculations. And another user asked us if they could see the actual market sector industry metric in Excel. So I believe they're asking if you don't want to see just a relative aspect, but you want to see the underlying market sector industry, PE, ROIC, any of those calculations. And the answer is yes, you can see those. We can back calculate those out in Excel. So if you would like to add those to any existing spreadsheets that you're using or incorporate them in a new spreadsheet, just reach out to your account manager and we can incorporate any of these kind of metrics into the spreadsheets that you're using. And then the last question we received was right before the end of the content. Someone asked if they could have access to the cryptocurrency watch list on the dashboard. And you can create your own cryptocurrency watch list. We actually just added those a couple weeks ago. So to do so, you can either click on create a watch list on the dashboard, or you can search any of the cryptocurrencies in the top search bar. For example, you can look up Bitcoin. And then once you go to Bitcoin's price page, you can add it to a watch list at the top of that page. So that will be the end of this current webinar. So we will see you all next month, and let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.